Welcome to our series, Poetry for the Soul, Part 12. And this will complete our series. Some of the quotes are repeated for those who find something to cherish in them. Poetry is most just to its divine origin when it administers the comforts and breathes the thoughts of religion. William Wordsworth. Poetry is certainly something more than good sense, but it must be good sense, just as a palace is more than a house, but it must be a house. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Most people do not believe in anything very much. And our greatest poetry is given to us by those who do. Cyril Connolly. Boswell. Then, sir, what is poetry? Johnson. Why, sir, it is much easier to say what is not. We all know what light is, but it is not easy to tell what it is. Since the printing press came into being, poetry has ceased to be the delight of the whole community of man. It has become the amusement and delight of the few. John Masefield. British poet, 1878-1967. To me, it seems that one of the most important requisites for a great poet is a luminous style. The elements of poetry lie in natural objects, in the vicissitudes of human life, in the emotions of the human heart, and the relations of man to man. William Cullen Bryant. None but a poet can write a tragedy, for tragedy is nothing less than pain transmuted into exaltation by the alchemy of poetry. Edith Hamilton. An American educator and author known for popularizing classical Greek and Roman literature, 1867 to 1963. Poetry must be as new as foam and as old as the rock. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Great poetry is always written by somebody straining to go beyond what he can do. Stephen Spender. Poetry is more philosophical and of higher value than history. Aristotle. Poetry is the key to the hieroglyphics of nature. David Hare. Born 1947. Poetry is what Milton saw when he went blind. Don Marquis. The difference between genuine poetry and the poetry of Dryden, Pope, and all their school is briefly this: their poetry is conceived in their wits. Genuine poetry is conceived and composed in the soul. Matthew Arnold. Poetry is emotion put into measure. The emotion must come by nature, but the measure can be acquired by art. Thomas Hardy. The office of poetry is not to make us think accurately, but feel truly. Frederick W. Robertson, English preacher, born 1840. In his poetry, as well as in his life, Shelley was indeed a beautiful and ineffectual angel, beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. Matthew Arnold. Money is everywhere, but so is poetry. What we lack are the poets. Federico Fellini. Poetry implies the whole truth. Philosophy expresses only a particle of it. Henry David Thoreau. Poetry is not a profession, it is a destiny. Mikhail Dudin. A poem is an emotional machine made of words. Philip Larkin. What is life without a touch of poetry in it? W.S. Gilbert in The Pirates of Penzance. The poem is a little myth of man's capacity of making life meaningful. And in the end, the poem is not a thing we see. It is rather a light by which we may see. And what we see is life. Robert Penn Warren. We conclude this 12-part series with Sri Aurobindo on overhead poetry, and highly recommend reading his Letters on Poetry and Art, The Future Poetry, and especially his magnum opus, Savitri. Sri Aurobindo. I have said that overhead poetry is not necessarily greater or more perfect than any other kind of poetry, but perhaps a subtle qualification may be made to this statement. It is true that each kind of poetical writing can reach a highest or perfect perfection in its own line and in its own quality. And what can be more perfect than a perfect perfection? Or can we say that one kind of absolute perfection is greater than another kind? What can be more absolute than the absolute? But then what do we mean by the perfection of poetry? There is the perfection of the language, and there is the perfection of the word music and the rhythm, beauty of speech and beauty of sound. But there is also the quality of the thing said, which counts for something. If we consider only word and sound and what in themselves they evoke, we arrive at the application of the theory of art for art's sake to poetry. On that ground, we might say that a lyric of Anacreon is as good poetry and as perfect poetry as anything in Aeschylus or Sophocles or Homer. the question of the elevation or depth or intrinsic beauty of the thing said cannot then enter into our consideration of poetry, and yet it does enter, with most of us at any rate, and is part of the aesthetic reaction, even in the most aesthetic of critics and readers. From this point of view, the elevation from which the inspiration comes may, after all, matter, provided the one who receives it is a fit and powerful instrument. For a great poet will do more with a lower level of the origin of inspiration than a smaller poet can do, even when helped from the highest sources. In a certain sense, all genius comes from overhead, for genius is the entry or inrush of a greater consciousness into the mind, or a possession of the mind by a greater power. Every operation of genius has at its back, or infused within it, an intuition, a revelation, an inspiration, an illumination, or at least a hint or touch or influx from some greater power or level of conscious being than those which men ordinarily possess or use.